to give opening remarks. Dr. Malena?
Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank our speaker, Mr. Michael Kertois. I also hope I pronounced you right. And the lecturers and the students for being with us today via online and also via Facebook Live. We are very honored to have Michael with us to share his experience, his knowledge on urban public transport. I'm certain that this talk will be beneficial to the students, particularly in understanding on public transport and also to understand on the challenges that we are facing here in Malaysia, particularly in transit cities, yeah, and public transport and gain a new insight with us, and we are very looking forward to hear your talk. So now I pass back to our Madam Moderator, Ms. Shakila. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maliana, for your opening remarks. So we can start now, but before before I give this room to Mike, I would like to brief introduction or background, Mike background. So Mike is a country manager for Mott McDonald Malaysia Sdn Bhd, part of the Mott McDonald Group. Mott McDonald is a 16,000 strong UK headquartered, employee-owned consultancy working in the areas of engineering, management and development. Mott McDonald has been working in Malaysia for over 100 years on energy, transport and other projects, and the local company was registered in 1990. Michael has a geography degree from Queen Mary College, University of London, and is a chartered land surveyor with the Royal Institutions of Chartered Surveyors UK. He was an active member of the Permanent Way Institutions when in UK, chairing his local sections of the Railway Trade Institution. Mike spent the first 14 years of his career working for a UK consultant. This included time working in Hong Kong, Indonesia, and Ghana. This provided him with experience on highway development and airport projects in many countries and an insight into their standards and localized approaches. For the last 24 years, Michael has primarily worked on railway and public transport projects, which include High-Speed Trail 1 in the UK, linking London to the Channel Tunnel, with his work mainly concentrated in London area, including the city centre, terminus at St Pancras, trams, West London and Croydon trams in London, metros in Dublin Metro North, London's Northern Line Extension, Bangkok Metro, Singapore MRT, Melbourne Rail Developments, Sydney Rail Development, and MR22 entry Kuala Lumpur. So this project required the movement of large numbers of people through rapidly expanding urban areas and the challenge of integrating the stations into the urban environment, which is critical to the user experience, particularly the first and last mile. Michael has been a city dweller and a commuter for over 50 years and presently live in the Masjid India area of Kuala Lumpur, where he walks and uses public transport as much as possible. He enjoys cooking and is a regular visitor to wet market to support local business. So quite interesting all your background, which is you like to cook. I hope that you know how to cook the Malay food or Malaysian food.
Yeah, it's getting better. I do experiment. I have made my own laksa from scratch, absolutely everything from scratch. So
all right, I wish you all the best for the local food cooking. All right, Mike. So without waiting any time, so I would like to give the room for you to present your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good morning all. It's a great pleasure to address you today. I have a very, very sort of broad range of experiences. Juan Shakila has identified. I've got a long history with public transport as a user and working at the on the business end. So it's fascinating to see both sides and to go and travel to many places. I've been very fortunate in my career that it's taken me to many places around the world with public transport systems, and to sort of compare and contrast the offerings. This work is, and what really brings me to this discussion or this session, is the Global Future Cities programme. So this work is part of the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office work to carry out targeted technical assistance to support sustainable urban development. And that's spread across 19 cities in 10 countries. There's an ASEAN program in itself, which covers from Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, through to Malaysia, Thailand, and Myanmar. The program inevitably focuses on 3 core areas, which are urban planning, transportation, and resilience. And these are obviously all keen to how we develop and how we improve what we do and how we live our lives. So it's fundamental to the economic development of any country, which is, as you probably noticed, some of the projects that I've been involved with and still engaged with are very much in the developed world, because there is this forever need to increase economic output and build back better after this pandemic, and during it, and understanding what impact that has on what we're doing. So I've broken the agenda down into 8 topic areas. There's, why public transport, looking through some of the modes that public transport uses. There is often in developing countries a desire to create as many modes as possible, and what we really have to do is look at the economics of scale and the benefits that brings. Some consideration of planning and cities in Malaysia, and what have been implemented, and looking at the sort of policy decisions that sit behind it. If we understand some of the policy, then we can understand what gets implemented and why. The challenges of bringing transit to cities, so really having a broader understanding of it's quite difficult to retrofit or put something in after you've built and developed a city, and it's what becomes appropriate, what becomes difficult. Looking at some of Malaysia's experiences, and then really drilling into it and saying, well, what actually do we want for public transport? We could have pushed this up the top, but I wanted to hold it back, because you need to define the challenge, and then you can actually say, well, what do we want? There's a whole process which has really come into the railway industry, and into wider construction of systems engineering, which has come a lot of that from the sort of space and safety critical work on oil and gas, and it's defining a set of requirements. So effectively number 6 represents our listing down our personal requirements of what do we actually want it to do. That would then obviously create you something along the lines of a red, amber, green assessment of for a multi-criteria analysis of deciding what you might want to do and how you want to approach it. Then we move into the realms of things like transit-oriented development, which I'll cover briefly, but it's to me, it's perhaps slightly broader. Yes, these are important, and they're actually good revenue stream, or potentially good revenue streams, but they can also be challenging, and it's how you factor it in and work out how that fits. And then lastly, with a little bit of a conclusion, it's really looking at how we need to be creating that modal shift. There is that with greenhouse gas emissions and those broader challenges, we need to factor that in and say, how do we go forward with this? So just a quick start on terminology, because one thing that everybody always talks about, and you can spend a lot of time in the same room and you're not quite sure if you're involved in the same conversation. And you're also going to have to put up with my slight sense of humour, and it gets very dry. So, we have transit and public transport and mobility, and it's really, where does one start, where does the other one end? Pretty much for this, I've used the terminology public transport, understanding that mobility and those sorts of issues are far wider, but it's really putting that focus back firmly on the public transport aspect of that. Occasionally I've had to abbreviate it to PT. We then have MARS, and I shouldn't have put the two middle A's in capitals, so mobility as a service, and we need to look at how that can be rolled out in the longer run and how it might benefit us, and that's, you know, the bringing technology and how we connect people through that. And one of the other favourites of mine is always how we define stations. So we get stops, interchanges, and as in the introduction, we also have the dreaded word terminus, which is a Latin word meaning where the things end. So the end station on a line is often referred to as the terminus. There is probably a whole library of these terms that we need to get thinking about when we get into transit and transport. We also need to consider, you know, the basics of the passengers, and, you know, public transport, it's all about the public and therefore as broad a section of society as possible. So that brings into play the concepts of inclusivity, and as it is on our Global Future Cities programme, the GESI element, which is gender equality and social inclusion. So, you know, just getting people to think about the challenges and opening it up at an earlier point. So we've got the issues of disability, you know, often summarised into OKU, but, you know, we've got mobility, we've got sight, we've got sound, and we've got all the other things that form that as well, you know, and it's creating those sort of safe environments, considered environments that help people access it. If we're doing it for these sorts of groups, then we're probably doing it for the wider public, and that's important. Obviously, the issues of gender and gender equality on transport and some of the stats are interesting, and, you know, as we'll see later. And there's age related, so we go through school children, students like many of you on this session, and the elderly, and then family and economic and social activities. So I think this is the opportunity to flick up the first poll question if we can. So which really sets up a scene of me understanding what some of you are doing. So hopefully that appears on your screens. I'm not quite sure how that works. Go on, Shakila.
You want to see the result now?
If we can pump, if we've got it, or pop it up, and let's see what we've got coming in.
All right. Oh, wait a minute.
I put some of these in to break it up and get a little bit of interaction.
We still have 2 votes so far. I think
okay.
because we just share again the link. So to all the students and participants, please join the survey. They had 3 links in the chat box, so please click one by one because we have 3 questions. So Mike would like to see the result regarding the public transportation usage among the Malaysian. So please click the link share and you can answer the polls. We will give time for the participants to join.
Thank you. Yes, so, you know, we need to set out the need for public transport while they're doing that. And, you know, we consider some of the challenges faced by cities have congestion and delays, you know, which have a massive impact on the economy. We have noise, we have poor air quality, and in general, we have aging populations. You know, population growth isn't happening in the same way. If you look at demographics, we're actually pushing through into that older range. I went and had my COVID jab yesterday, and being classified as being over 60, I was escorted to the front of the queue, which pleased me no end. But it shows the sort of challenges, and that group will keep growing. We also obviously have things like the physical inactivity, which brings with it the risk of obesity, cardiovascular diseases, and diabetes. And you can look at the diabetes figures. I'll show you some of that with you later. Got the challenges of social exclusion and making sure that things are accessible for everyone. But the realities are often we just do not have the funds for investment. Why is that not moving? Sorry. Okay, so if we look at the economic benefits of public transport, public transport will help to remove congestion, which it's acknowledged is, that has that huge economic cost. Increased productivity, we can move skills, labour and knowledge around. And it also creates land values, and I know land values have already been seen to rise around the MRTs here, but it creates that strong link between land values and public transport, and also can bring about urban regeneration. There are significant social benefits of public transport. In itself, it's helping to remove social isolation. This can be sort of through low income, the elderly and people with disabilities. We know there are so many challenges out there. The decided areas of low income, the urban poor is a really big issue, and actually a lot of that now seems to fall into urban poor and elderly. As economies keep growing, the savings that were there and inflation keeps running does mean that all these things get eaten away, and that's the practicalities of it. Public transport will then open up access to key economic and employment opportunities for the lower income. And that obviously is fundamental and underpins how we keep everybody occupied in the economy. You don't want to be having to subsidise various groups. That's an economic challenge. So the more people you have employed in worthwhile and economic real opportunities, the more money you bring into your economy. Also, fundamentally, provides access to education and healthcare. These are sort of fundamental to the future, and also fundamental to having a healthy population. The also need to look at the health benefits. So actually commuting promotes an active lifestyle, whether it's walking or using some other form of active mobility to get to the nearest station or stop, and that in turn considerably reduces a burden on the healthcare system. I mean, there are international statistics on all this. We also need to consider its environmental benefits. So it creates in general a cleaner environment. We reduce air pollution from vehicles. It's estimated that one bus is the equivalent of 40 cars. Just looking at all the emissions that we get from those, and this is part of a sort of wider conversation. We'll look at just briefly touch on electric vehicles later. But it's actually how we look at reducing pollution and the impact and the sheer numbers. One of the other things, of course, is once you're move to the realms of electric buses, which things like that are actually very expensive at present, you start to use electricity from renewable sources and collected well away from the city. So it's ways and means of bringing fuel into the city without the pollution. It also obviously helps to mitigate climate change. Climate change, we recognise, is a massive issue. We know that Malaysia's signed up to reduce considerably, as we'll show later, and it reduces that basic carbon dependency for power. Within our business, we view that the change in energy in transport will be one of the bigger issues, in the short and longer term future, because we're going to have to see a shift in mindset of how power is generated to move people around. Transport is a big consumer of power, and we need to look at it carefully. There's also the economic benefits of public transport. In cities, the movement of people to and from work needs to be done swiftly and smartly. So looking at the European experience, and sorry, I'll just reference this at this point. If you notice within square brackets, I've got a whole series of references which we'll share the slides later, and those really give you some places to go to look for more information and understanding what we've pulled in to do this work. So within the European experience on public transport, and the UITP is Union International of Transport Public, so a Euro-based organisation and well worth following. Their tweets are interesting and quite informative. So anyone from Transit Malaysia, they're also a good source of information. But it means looking at sort of quality of transport links is one of the most important factors for locating businesses. So as a country, if we're looking for foreign investment, having good transport links are important, because it's one of the things that businesses will look for. Quality of urban mobility and urban environment helps attract young talent, and that's certainly noticeable in sort of as a Londoner, we've seen huge numbers of younger staff have come to London as a centre where these things can be done readily, easily, and mobility is good, much improved from when I was growing up. Improved public transport increases the mobility of the labour force. We want people to be able to get around. We realise that everything now is really focusing on agile working and some form of agile working. I've been in my previous job, I've been with Mott MacDonald 10 years, but in my previous job I was working for a tiny consultancy, working for various clients, whether it was railway owners, contractors, other consultants, and that just shows how sort of mobile we've become, and the shape of the employment within countries has changed. So we understand that people need to be mobile. We can now come and do these sorts of events via video conferencing, but the whole sort of landscape's changed. And to me, and it's noticeable in Malaysia that, meetings and face-to-face meetings still predominate if wherever possible. And I think that's going to go on, but you need to be able to access people. And part of that is then driven by that public transport providing that connection. And public transport organisations themselves provide diverse and qualified jobs for people who live in urban areas. So, they often make up considerable numbers of staff and considerable numbers of the urban population as working within these organisations. We also need to align transit projects with the SDGs, and these are the SDGs that we've identified from the Future Cities programme. And I think it's the fundamentals. I flip the diagram round from the way we use it normally to kind of look at the broader aspects of how we need to change that focus. So we've got planning, so partnerships, and it's working together to deliver positive outcomes for public transport. And this covers everybody through transit owners, developers, tenants, all the sort of businesses. So it's identifying best practices and building those mutual beneficial relationships. And this, and often the transit owner sits within the public sector in some way, and bringing all these groups together so that there is a common interest and a common benefit from doing this. Looking at the outcomes, there's those four very, very broad topics, but it's getting that wider benefits out to these areas, creating these sustainable cities, places that people can move around, places that can accommodate infrastructure and industry and innovation. We look at some of these key hubs, and it's important that we're encouraging that new and young talent as well as the existing businesses. It obviously improves climate action, we're on a much more sustainable basis, and looking at gender equality and the broader GESI aspects, it's much more inclusive. The impact then creates those decent work opportunities. It reduces those inequalities because these are shared. It improves gender equality and helps to reduce poverty because people actually have access to work. So I'm not quite sure how many answers we've got to the first straw poll.
All right, okay.
I have to stop sharing.
Yeah, I think it's quite amazing because we already have almost 172 vote from the participants. So I will share the screen.
please. Yep.
Okay.
Do I need to stop? Or...
All right. So do you see my screen?
Yeah, it's just coming up.
Okay. So for questions one.
Yep.
Okay, so for questions one, which factor is most important to you when using public transport? So most of the participants vote for accessible. I think accessible. The first answer is accessible.
Yep.
57.69%, and for the
Yep.
next questions two. How do you travel to university or work? So most of them travel by car, 42%. And questions number three. Which mode of public transport have you taken? So I think the highest is bus, 22.86%, 48 votes. And then the second highest is LRT and KTM commuter, and also the MRT. So the lowest is the BRT, because we only have BRT in Subang.
Yeah, no, I know. It's just interesting to get people's experience of public transport, and thank you very much for answering those questions. It's
So
really
you can share your screen now.
Yeah, I'll go back to presenting. So it's interesting to see, what people do. So there's a very sort of as one would expect in Malaysia, there's a reasonably high level of car dependence, even among younger groups, and that represents the sort of challenge. If we're going to create that modal shift in the long run. So and just good to see how that people do have experience of public transport, and this is one of the, certainly as more and more is developed, it becomes more necessary to actually get people experiencing, and that's one of the things that we're trying to work on and build on as part of the program. So if we look at public transport in Malaysia, and this is really a timeline of the introduction of public transport, and realizing that their bases are very different, but it's useful to kind of think about it in context, and then think that what that means for the habits that we've created in country. It's the human factor. It's the piece of saying, well, if we're going to create modal shift, or if we're going to create change, what have we got in the first place, and therefore what are we trying to change? So if we look at public transport modes, the first railways really go back as far as well into the 1880s, around 1885. A lot of them were associated with moving heavy materials around, so with the primary industries. But they also provided those first long distance connections in Malaysia. So whilst many initially were sort of really going to the local ports, over time that north-south corridor developed to link the country together, and the movement of freight and passengers became more important. On the KTM network, we see the ETS, the two commuter trains, one around KL and one around Penang, and the DMU services on the East Coast Line, which are just coming in. Some photos of those as they were under development. The ERL, which I think we forget at our peril, albeit it's a relatively short length. It's that connection down to KLIA that has the potential to expand. Obviously, there's the sort of the basic difference between the two railways is that the KTM network's a very historic railway. It runs on meter gauge, and the ERL is a standard gauge railway, looking really at shuttling people as quickly as possible from the airport to downtown. We also have ECRL, which is under construction at present, which will service much more of the East Coast and provide that link across back now through Gombak and potentially round to Port Klang. And of course, at the bottom, I've personally worked on 3 high-speed railways, including the high-speed rail here, and it will be interesting to see at which point that's reconsidered, or what's considered for the future developments of it. As one who's experienced the journey up and down from Iskandar, Malaysia, Johor Bahru many times, it's certainly something that is sorely missed, and it will be interesting to see what can be achieved, and we'll come to that a little bit later when the line is open for the Kemas to Johor double tracking. Surprisingly enough, yes, there were trams in Malaysia. They were in Penang. I've used a picture of mine from Hong Kong, but they were, I can assure you, they were only single level trams. The pictures I've seen, they go back as far as well into the 1880s. I think 1886 was when they were building the basic rail system. I think they were horse drawn to start with, and then were electrified. And your reference back to Mott MacDonald's involvement. One of the predecessor companies of Mott MacDonald was involved in the electrification of Penang Tram back in 1906 at a time. So that's how I've tracked down those connections. In general, they were replaced by trolley buses. Trolley buses are vehicles that run under wires. In city centres, still surprisingly common in Eastern Europe and in multiple places. So this is yet another example of taking different vehicle modes and considering how they might impact in Malaysia. We've got the future projects, we've got KL Tram and, potentially in the DBKL plans, and Penang Tram coming up as part of those developments. The challenges are they're street running, and I was living in Hong Kong when they introduced the light rapid transit, which is effectively a street running tram out in the new territories of Hong Kong. So in the newly developed areas, there was a bit more space, but there were considerable numbers of fatalities and accidents when it was being introduced because people just weren't willing to change habits. So we talk about habits to create modal shift, but we also need to have habits around, and positive habits around, public transport and their modes and what they actually mean for us. And they can also be costly to fit into streets because you're having to embed rails in it. You're dealing with modern systems. They are very, very quiet. I used to commute into my office in South London on one every day. That's the Mott MacDonald office. So some cities have experienced huge cost overruns. So it's something to be taken carefully. I think we then come to buses, and obviously these are very much tied into the introduction of automobiles and that sort of technology. And historically, they have been the major mode of transport in Malaysia. In 1901, I've tracked down, there was a service started between Kuala Lumpur and Ampang. By 1909, a bus service was launched in Malacca State. Just to pick up on this, in the 1950s, there were over 500 buses that I've managed to kind of identify because there was a series of bus strikes at the time, and it's one of the states we're working in. Just from pulling together all the newspaper reports, many of them talk about the buses it takes off the road. Suffice it to say, there's nowhere near that number now, and we've created a situation where there are historically lots of buses, now not so many, but the population has risen by a factor of 3 or over 3. So, and I think this is a kind of a broader Malaysia issue. Clearly, buses run on normal infrastructure. So buses have relied on the development of roads. So in 1923, for example, Johor had 700 cars. Yes, it just shows how far we've come. And 120 commercial vehicles. But at the same time, there were only 926 kilometres of paved roads and 100 kilometres of unpaved roads. We've pulled out the numbers today, and you can see that percentage growth is huge. So we need to understand that we've got these bigger challenges that confront us. We've got to run buses, which continue to be the main mode of public transport across most of Malaysia and most of the Malaysian cities. It's going to be very expensive to put new infrastructure in, so it's thinking about how best to optimize them and optimize their use and really understanding what people need from them. But it's something that we mustn't forget, and we've got to plan for and think about how best to use them. We then move on to the LRT systems. So we have STAR, which became the Ampang line, which Ampang and Sri Petaling line opened in 1996, and the Putra line, or now Kelana Jaya line, which opened in 1998. Both lines have been considerably extended southwards to meet at Putra heights, and they're able, the real difference with these between them and a metro system, slightly different traction forms, i.e. how they're pad slightly differently, and they're in general able to rise and fall more quickly. So in an urban area, that's good, but obviously it comes with potentially reductions in passenger numbers. So the difference with that and a metro, it therefore creates the amount of throughput you can achieve. But as someone who uses the Kelana Jaya line to go to work, yes, it's a great piece of infra, and I deliberately live near Bangwangi LRT so I can get to work easily, and these are the sorts of decisions we make. Future LRT, whoops, I've missed LRT 3 off, haven't I? Apologies to your area in particular, which we also have involvement on, and we obviously have the RTS Woodlands to Johor Bahru. Obviously, the LRT 3 is going to be serving the Klang to One Utama sort of area of KL, as well as obviously looking at the Kelana Jaya line there with at Glen Marie. Station there on new interchanges. The other thing that we've got in Malaysia, obviously in KL, is the monorail. So it opened in 2003, and the city centre has a relatively limited capacity and has had various challenges. So these become very bespoke systems. There aren't that many monorails around the world, and that means that whenever you do something, you're having to pay more for it potentially, and you're bringing in different technologies. If all that said, there are other cities developing them, and there's one certainly going on in I think it's Cairo at present. Future monorail, Putrajaya, this is taken before the MRT2 works, had provision for a monorail line, and although some of this is now being removed to accommodate the new station, but it represents an opportunity to move people around Putrajaya more efficiently. BRT, so this is very much based on bus technology. It's potentially street running, although can often be segregated at street level. The one obviously we've got in Malaysia, which a few of you have ridden, is the BRT at Sunway, opened in 2015, and it runs pretty much along a full grade separated elevated route. Yes, I have been on it. I've been on every mode of public transport around Kuala Lumpur because that's what I do at weekends. So all these photos are my own. But it's interesting that these things are opening up to develop more. So we've got the future developments in Iskandar, Malaysia, where there's a BRT planned to open in 2023, and we're already seeing the incoming change in Sarawak, which is probably looking at something along the lines of an ART, autonomous rapid transit, which is effectively a different and more enhanced form of BRT, and that really is at present is looking at an opening date of 2025. These are interesting forms of transport. They are probably they're as cities build. Perhaps the Sunway BRT is not such a good example because it's very much on fixed infrastructure and it's elevated infrastructure, so that the cost of the structures will remain. If you can get them more at ground level, then you can be using just standard existing highways or widening highways and changing facilities. The key is then creating the right environments at the stops to enable people to access them. If you put them in the middle of roads, how do you get people to them? It's lifts, it's escalators, it's staircases, it's all the things that we would always wish to avoid, because someone then has to maintain all these things. But beneficially, they're going to be a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible, and can be used probably in the more low density cities better. Brings us then to the metro railways. So Metro or MRT Line 1 opened in 2017. So that's that section Sungai Buloh down to Kajang. Pictured as Tama Mutiara station in the sort of Cheras area. MRT2 is planned to open in 2021. I think it's got phased opening. So we'll see how on time that will be. It seems to be going well, so it's quite exciting to see some of these come to fruition. My first involvement with it, I was a peer reviewer for the alignment of it back in 2014, 2015 time. So in seeing the route now come to fruition, it's interesting to see which bits of guidance and advice have been picked up on and which bits have been changed, as other developments come into the picture. And obviously we've got MRT3, which is the Circle Line, is back being planned, and it will be interesting. I think, as the local marketplace has changed considerably in the last 3 or 4 years, how that evolves and how the project develops. We've got different skill sets in Malaysia now. Hopefully there will be less reliant on external work from flying people in, that we should really be looking to build our own internal markets. That's what one of my drivers is. I'll put my other hat on as a country manager and a business manager here. My staff are now 95% Malaysian. There's just we have a 30 over staff and we have 2 expats, so it's driving that and sharing this sort of knowledge with them, and we also have that capability then of pulling up to a much wider global marketplace. Having really then considered those sort of modes of public transport, I think we then need to kind of look at saying, well, that's where we've got to in terms of public transport, but now we need to perhaps reflect on some of the national policies. My approach to this has been to kind of look at the policies that have been, not the policies that we're planning for, if you see what I mean. So my brother's a historian. I have a little bit of a history geek in me. So it's actually going back and saying, well, look, this is what we planned. What have we actually got? And so quite neatly, some of the national plans align with sort of, periods that have just finished, the DBKL plan for 2020, etc. So that's the sort of approach I've taken to this section, to understand, well, what were we trying to do? How successful was it? And what can we learn? So if we look at the 11th Malaysia plan, and you'll now see where I'm coming from. So it's sort of saying, well, we've got to 2021, so that's just gone past 2020. What we actually really trying to do? So that introduce, and what do we have? How does it map with it? And therefore, what do we really need to then take forward? So looking at that plan, it introduced 4 transport strategies. Building an integrated need-based transport system. So it acknowledged that we need transportation for urban and rural communities. If you can't get around, the whole basis of trading, which is what economies are based on, falls apart. It and you will notice all these recurring themes. I'm sorry if there's always inherently a lot of repetition, but that's going to be one of the challenges, because it ensures that people are able to access and broaden their economic activities, and as well as personal activities for jobs, recreation, and daily necessities. The government wanted to provide sufficient and affordable access to transport to allow for safe and efficient flow of people and goods. So it keeps coming back to these things. Introduce 4 strategies. I've pulled out only the ones that are relevant. Yes, there are only 3 there, but I removed A3. I think it was ports, and it's not particularly relevant to what we're trying to do, and it's trying to bring out that focus. So the 4 strategies, and A1 in particular, was enhancing the connectivity of cross-transport modes and regions through connectivity between those, promoting public transport in both rural and urban areas, and optimizing transport planning. If you get good transport planning, you're going to end up with good projects. If you think it all through, if you create a good plan, if you fail to plan, then you normally fail to deliver, and that's that it's such a truism. And you're built on your foundations of how you think about things, what you do, and how you work it. We also have the regulatory aspects of it. And I think A4 is important because it's this introduction, or the concept of a national transport model, which I still think is a bit of a challenge. So picking up on that, when they extended that, it was increasing public transport modal share in cities. It's aiming to raise to 40%, in Klang Valley, and 20% in other capital cities, acknowledging the KVMRT new lines and KTMB transformation. I mean, they're on their way, but they're probably still lagging, and I think there are opportunities there. Deploying roads and public transport, so it's creating bus networks which complement rail networks, and I think it's interesting. The dominance of buses and the importance of buses in Malaysia outside Kuala Lumpur cannot be understated. They are public transport outside Kuala Lumpur in most instances. So it's really looking at how we can improve that, and this becomes a bit of a recurring theme. And I think in some respects they're slightly underplayed. It's optimizing transport planning, so looking at the concepts of TOD, looking for planning for development of road and rail networks to integrate those, and creating that regular engagement between stakeholders and transport planners. We see so many developments. As someone who's travelled up and down the North-South Highway many times, and certainly, you look at things and you kind of go, you look at new developments, and as an outsider, I question it sometimes, and you see a huge new development, and I ask the question, where's the nearest public transport? And it can often be, many kilometres away. So it's actually rethinking what we do. It means that everything has to become innately flexible. We can't wait for it to happen. We need to be thinking and planning for it before we do it. And if we want to create fixed infrastructure, which, as I reflect, comes with a huge cost, we need to drill that in at the beginning. And I think, looking at strategy A4, it's the national transport model to formulate integrated transport policies. And, that's capturing that demand and capacity assessment of new transport. If we're going to do something, there's got to be a reasoned basis for doing it. One of the things that we're really doing on the Global Future Cities Programme is looking at creating that evidence base, and these all form that evidence base. If we look at the national transport policy, which kind of came along at the end of it, end of the 11th plan, it's looking at that economic competitiveness, considering the social elements and environmental protection. So this picked up on some of those previous trends, and it obviously goes back to far earlier national plans, but it then gets incorporated in. It's still that driver of the national economy. The kind of reflections within it that Malaysians have been disappointed at the lack of an efficient public transport system, forcing them to rely on their own transport, which in turn leads to congestion. So, you know, there's a lot of acknowledgement of the challenges out there. In the same way, there's that, you know, Malaysia has the second highest road fatality risk among ASEAN countries. You know, these are huge costs to the economy. 8.8 billion ringgit is a lot of money. You know, and think about how many projects and work we can do by saving some of that money. We need to transfer some of this spending into areas that we're going to benefit from. So the national transport policy contains 5 thrusts. You know, strengthen governance, optimize and build and maintain the infrastructure, enhance safety, integration, connectivity and accessibility. You'll notice those words coming up that we had in the first poll. So, you know, these are things that underpin what we do. Really for seamless journeys. So I think, you know, one of our challenges, and someone who travels a lot, even on relatively short journeys, it's that thinking about how we integrate them all. So it's that seamless part. Green the transport economy, and that obviously we need to look at how we create that greener and more environmentally friendly environment. I think on cities, transport has that key role in ensuring the efficient operation of economic activities. And I think, you know, the third bullet down, the ownership of cars in Malaysia is amongst the highest in the world. Best practices from developed cities has indicated that infrastructure development to accommodate increasing private ownership leads to an unsustainable spiral. As I said, my first 14 years was designing highways, and really I moved out of the highway industry when we decided in the UK that we couldn't really absorb any more highways, because all we were doing was building highways and then creating more demand for cars, or capacity for cars, and the people were filling that capacity. So we needed to create that quantum shift in attitude towards it all. I think just sort of summarising some of the key issues out of that national transport policy. You know, it recognised town planning must be integrated seamlessly. Transit-oriented developments represented a good way of dealing with this. It says ideal. Nuances on words, differences on words. Integrating land use planning and public transport planning. It's always a challenge, and we'll have a little look at that shortly. Ensure integration of developments with the public transport system, and then there's a series of topics. We'll share the slides, but it's getting people to pull up some of these high level issues and kind of go, these are all recognised in national and even local plans. I think one of our base challenges, and this is a much simplified version in my previous talk, MyTrans. It was the speaker from, I believe it was Mari, put up a diagram which actually showed about another 15 boxes in this. So I think, and this is part of the challenge. It's how do we integrate this, and it's recognised across what we do that there are so many interfaces. So when you look at things like the government structure, there is this risk of creating silos, and it's interesting that we have things like and you know, the ones that I always struggle with more, and I mean that in a nice way, not a nasty way, but it's kind of how we think about things. Is we've got the Ministry of Works, which is really controlling the highways, and then we have the Ministry of Transport controlling public transport. Our main mode of public transport in Malaysia is the bus. The bus travels on the highway. It's a nice simple bit of logic, but it then means that we've got a considerable challenge that we've got our main public transport mode is running along someone else's road, someone else's infrastructure, and it's how do we create that. Interestingly, I found it interesting. We get little things like MyROS sits underneath the Ministry of Transport, so you're dealing with safety on roads, I understand there's integration, but these things are recognised as challenges. We then look at the kind of the wider piece, and we've got things like electric buses being procured out of the Department of Environment and Water, CASA. So it just shows kind of the breadth of what we're doing. Some of the public transport systems, albeit that they're regulated out of the Ministry of Transport, actually officially parked under the Ministry of Finance. And then we've got some of the more fundamental pieces under the Prime Minister's department. So we've got things like MITE and MAMPU. If we really start looking at what we want to do in terms of sharing data and data governance and things like that, that obviously is, we're moving into the realms of open data, and as data are collected more and more, that creates the environment of data raya, big data. So actually that ability to access it and share it needs to be thought about and rolled out across the board. So yeah, there are important integrations that we need to make. It's just how we sometimes need to join it all together. So if you remember the slide on stakeholder engagement and SDGs, one of the relationships we need to build is actually at federal level. It's getting this and understanding where everybody fits in. So under public transport for MOT, we've got bus licensing, we've got railways, we've got air transport, and so on in the public sector. Highways, we've got existing and new highways really coming under KKR, as well as locally under the state JKR variant. But there's a lot of sort of bus policy being created by the states, which then goes back up. And then you probably drive down to Majlis level where people really understand their local area much better, and that's then creating those bus stops, that access, and what they want to do in terms of development, and those linkages out to people like Plan Malaysia. Which brings me to Plan Malaysia. That was a good segue. So Plan Malaysia has guidance, and it identifies, as I reflected earlier, these commitments to reduce carbon in 2015. Malaysia committed to reducing its carbon use to by 45% by 2030, which is a massive target. And you realise that how much of that is probably tied up in transport, which is reflecting earlier, and the need to create that shift. Obviously, the basic challenge of once you've got subsidised fuel costs, that then creates another challenge in itself. I'll flip to the right-hand side because I picked this up from an article in 2017, and it's the design elements of a green neighbourhood. So it covers walkable, bicycle networks, parking management, green network. If you notice what's missing, it's actually any linkage to transport. It talks all around transport. I'm sorry, it's not intended to be massively critical, but it's interesting. It's showing that sort of mindset that it's talked about parking, but it's not talked about transport anywhere. And it's and this is, to me, what I'm trying to lay out is the kind of the mindset that we've got to, and therefore how we need to change that mindset to think about how we do things differently. The other one I'll bring you back to is item number 2, which is Safe City 2010. And this is talking about the provision of CCTV, which is great. UK has lots and lots of CCTV. But it also introduced bollards, railings, lighting, which is good, and elevated crossings. Now, I don't know about you, but if I walk anywhere in a city, the one thing I detest is going up and down. And elevated crossings, putting in footbridges everywhere is not my cup of tea. That's a very English phrase. I don't like it. No, this is where it becomes personal, but it's also personal experience. And everybody says in Malaysia it's very hot, it's very wet. So why are you making me climb up a set of steps when it's sweaty? We need to be doing something about traffic management. I put up a picture of a particularly poorly laid out junction to my own staff in the office some time ago, and it needed moving the pedestrian crossing 15 metres, and the first thing they suggested was putting in a bridge. Someone's then got to maintain it for 100 years, and these come with costs. So it's thinking about how we're making use of smart infrastructure. I'll come on to one-way systems later. But we've also created all these bollards and railings. A lot of this is for safety, but they're also acting as positive, as barriers. Sorry, I'll get off my high horse in a second. So bringing transit to cities, and this is one of the ones I wanted to sort of cover at the beginning was, what is already going on in our cities. So this is looking at the dominant modes of transport in 2020 for Malaysia, and I've just put up the UK as a comparison with their percentages. So UK approximately double the population, and in fact, the number of cars is remarkably similar. Numbers of motorcycles is the huge difference. In fact, the percentage number of buses are similar, but what we don't know in there is really the use of the buses. So in the UK, long distance buses aren't really used, and it would be interesting to know in Malaysia what percentage are those longer distance buses and what percentage that lower local range. The huge difference is that percentage of railways. So obviously UK had the benefits of empire funding to build its railways effectively, so we ended up with an awful lot of railways. So it's 5 times more railways in length. I haven't covered the land area, but you can start, it's just drawing out those comparisons. So the motorcycles seem to be infilling what we've got from railways, and there does seem to be a potential disproportion. It's one that probably worth drilling into further, is just a light understanding, but just looking at that you suddenly realize the dominance of the car and motorcycle on Malaysia. So older streets and older cities provide challenges for shoehorning in. So this is Jalan Tar, just around the corner from me. So it's got that narrow street, that historic dense development. One of the problems that Malaysia has, I'm aware of, is the challenges of land acquisition. I was involved in a lot of land acquisition for new rail projects in the UK, and we could actually tunnel under pretty much anything we wanted within reason, and we were just buying the ground underneath houses or underneath developments. Most of the new lines we tried to put underneath existing infrastructure. In Malaysia, if you're trying to turn a corner, and in fact this is the junction of Jalan Tar and if I've got the right one, no, it's just a little bit further along, and Jalan Sultan Ismail, where the monorail turns sharply left. And these are the sort of problem areas, and it's how do we maintain speed, because you're suddenly introducing a very sharp change of direction that impacts on speed. It's basic Newtonian physics and circular acceleration. So we need to merge modern infrastructure into historic areas, and the huge cost of building, and especially if you're building on the surface, you've got considerable disruption to existing transport networks. Which really then says, well, we've got new cities, and this is Putrajaya, as you probably recognise. I've also been fortunate enough on my work. My work has taken me to Brasilia, which is 1961 when it was opened, and that suffered from public transport issues as well. So it's got, when you create these things, you've got initial low densities, and putting in high costs of fixed infrastructure into them when they're low density, it's very hard to get a return on them quickly, and you need to consider what you're going to be doing. So but it's also thinking, and I think the potentially little lessons for what we come up with on TODs are, if you're just creating sort of mono-use areas, single-use areas, so if you've just got offices, your commuting times, your times you're going to be using public transport are actually relatively fixed. It's going to be morning rush hour, evening rush hour. How can you fund a public transport project that's going to only really operate in those hours? And that's a massive limitation. So you have to build something inherently flexible. I think in the end, you kind of come back to the bus, which in effect is what's been running all this time. However, that says, you do need, when you think about these things, it is making that passive provision. So your passive provision is you create areas that can be used in future for transport or whatever you wish. So whether it's future developments or future transport. The main boulevard in Putrajaya, as you may know, actually has tunnels built in underneath it to accommodate monorail or whatever is selected in the future. I still think they have the challenge of getting fair revenue, because my visits to ministries there very much shows it's still very much single use. Just picking up on transport in cities, and this is a quote just recently from New South Wales, but it's like the biggest influence on decision to drive into the CBD in Sydney was the availability of parking, and that actually becomes something to think about. So looking at Malaysia's experiences, so we've got the DBKL 2020 plan. So this was dating back to 2004, but the 1984 plan set out plans to promote bus and rail transport, provide a comprehensive road network, and complete the LRT. Well, the LRT was obviously, but achieving significant modal shift from private has not been achieved, and this was 2004. Lack of integration, the various modes of transport, and between land use and planning and public rail-based planning. So it probably identifies the two things, this is 17 years ago, which I think is still challenging us. Again, it kind of looks at the some of the things that need to be done. So it's it picks up on the, so this is the 2004, when it was written, being the 2020 plan, and it's that inadequate coordination of policies concerning public transport and public-private transport modes, which is really we start looking at ministry, we're looking at federal territory, we're looking at all the layers that sit within it, and how do we integrate all those so we get the best solutions. Identified that a bus network was required. It was good to see the buses getting a plug. It's so easy to forget what we use today and think we're going to change everything tomorrow, but it's how do we get the most out of what we already have. Did mention parking. Just to flip back, it also mentioned pedestrians and TOD. Just looking in terms of public, and this is then looking at the 2040 plan. So, this is the draft 2040 plan. So, looking at public transport in 2017, you can see where Kuala Lumpur sits in relation to some of the ASEAN countries. So, identifying the need for active mobility and effective traffic management, but those are Malaysia sitting at the bottom of the pile, or Kuala Lumpur sitting at the bottom of the pile on public transport usage. So one of the things sort of looking at was Kuala Lumpur's challenges of geography. So, it's a relatively low density. So I've pulled out from Demographia some basic statistics. It's got dispersed central areas. You've got the historic centre around the Masjid Jamek, Pasar Seni, Datar and Merdeka area, and obviously these new centres of KLCC and Bukit Bintang, which are 1 kilometre removed from that, often up a hill, Bukit being a clue. So that represents challenges for mobility, and even the connectivity today is pretty poor between them. And you've got this new donut effect, which as described by Think City, it's certainly all these new developments at KL Central, at Bangsar, at Bangsa South, at Mongkiar, at Ampang, and so it goes on. Just looking at the land areas, you realise that density is low, and that percentage public transport. So that you start looking at correlations in here. You also look at the consequential increase in some of the health issues, and those become a problem in themselves. I think if we look at some of the challenges, it's the availability of parking. Central market, and we've got parking slap bang outside. That's poor transport connectivity. If you compare how far Pasas any LRT station is from the central market, okay, it's not to access the central market, but just conceptually, and then even where the nearest bus stop is, it's the parking is outside, the bus stop's remote and uncovered access. So relatively slow rail transport. We've got the challenge of KTM, lack of information, and poor active mode infrastructure. If we look at Malaysia's challenges, bus is that main mode of transport, and we need to look at the first and last mile. Remarkably few bus lanes. We've got the planning and standards for them not particularly well understood. We need to improve prioritization of traffic lanes and bus lanes, and we've got the issue of enforcement parking. So on the bottom right image this is during Ramadan Bazaar, but the DBKL tow truck was parked in the bus stop. You can see where the bus is having to dock. If the tow truck can't get it right, and those in authorities can't get it right, apologies to the individuals, but if we can't do that, then we're not going to bring the right behaviours forward. If we look at active mobility challenges, and these are just on my daily walk, all taken within a few hundred meters from my condo. Apart from that's outside KKR's headquarters, where we've got a drop curb on one side, and then we reach a step curb in the middle. So, but we've got all the OKU piece. We've got a nice bit of cycle lane in the contraflow direction over on near Menara DBKL. We've got the perennial challenges of parking on pavements. This is these my favourite bollards. These were to reduce crime, but how do you get a wheelchair between them? And if you're disabled or with small children, we're creating barriers rather than permeability. So we need to break down that. And then straight outside, and I'm actually looking at it now, we have my crossing that goes straight into a flower bed. For our answers, please. But it's thinking and planning for all these things, and are we creating barriers to what we do rather than creating opportunities? And if people can't access the bus stop, needless to say, this is next to a bus stand, so how do we get to the buses? So what do we want from public transport? And it's all relates to our willingness to accept public transport, so it's accessible, reliable, affordable, direct, fast, safe, and comfortable. So kind of breaking those down. So it's accessible. So it's this first and last mile experience. It's yet again, we've got bollards, but now they've put chains between them. So I'm not quite sure where the pedestrian is meant to go. And that's a defined crossing point. Nearby, we've got the bus stop with the parking, but it can't dock. We've built barriers along it. These are just sort of, if we're going to create that change, and we understanding that the cost of change is related to the modes that we wish to use, then the bus has got to be our primary mode at present until economies grow, places grow, we can afford better, and densities increase. We need to know when it's going to arrive, and I think that's one of the things that picked up on earlier. So, frequent services. So, this is metros to me is probably an every 6 minute survey. As a railway and a bus every 10 minutes. These are the sorts of concepts in an urban area you want to turn up and go. But it's also having that information, whether it's from a timetable like that, or whether it's from an app. So, and the app often tells us how affordable it is. So, affordable fares benefit the economy and enable us to look at the costs of other modes. Often, this is Pulse from Prasarana, and that's now really just coming in and being plugged heavily. Its walking routes still struggle, and to me, it's the first and last mile piece yet again. So what do we need from public transport? It's understanding where people actually need to go and getting there in a direct manner. So this is the work we've been doing in Malacca, and we created an app called or used an app called Perjalanan Ku, which was developed to understand people's mobility and was run over a period of time. Basically, it goes from green through to red, and it shows where people want to go. So it's understanding those where people's mobility and movement habits. That important factor of going, we need to go there in a direct manner. And which brings me to my other pet hate in Malaysia, is one-way systems. The Seremban racetrack, as I always describe it, if you go to Seremban, the whole of the city centre is ringed by a road that's been made one way. I don't understand. But these become barriers. You can't cross them. And all of a sudden you need a footbridge to get across. The footbridge becomes a barrier. Bringing me back to my old friend buses again. If we have a bus, that means that the bus has to go in one direction. So most of the bus routes, you can go 5 minutes in one direction to go to the shop. You then have to do 25 minutes in the other direction to go back, which is kind of, it's illogical. We're creating journeys. In Malacca, if I take the bus from the heritage area and go shopping at Dataran Palawan or Mahkota Parade, I can get there. I then have to go back to the bus station at Malacca Central and then take the bus, you can't stay on the same bus to get back to where I've come from. The one-way systems have been put in for traffic benefit, but we need to think about the impact they have on public transport, the impact they have on permeability. It's going to recognise that, the wider the road, the harder it is to cross, the less safe people feel, and also we need alternative means. It's making journey times acceptable. So, and I think, KTM has been one of my long-term challenges on this. We realise that conditions are fairly poor on the railway and have been for various historic reasons, but it needs to be competitive. So when someone phrased a question to me about putting a TOD, Pulau Sabang, it's an interesting site, but we've got to get acceptable journey times to it. It's 35 kilometres from Malacca. The bus takes forever and a day and is fairly infrequent. And as a tourist coming to Malaysia, you might think, I'm going to go to Malacca on the train. No one would do that. And I think that's what the figures show. The journey times are very, very slow. There are opportunities. If you actually look, those are the journey times in 1957. And that was the express train took 1 hour and 20 minutes. And today, this is to Seremban, and today the commuter service takes 1 hour and 20 minutes. So, we've invested lots of money, but are we actually getting the return on our investment, and how's it improving what we're doing? If you think about, the Gamas to Johor completion, that potentially could enable you to run a train faster from JB to KL Central. The challenges are that you've got all the commuter trains in the way, so that's going to slow you down. And if it's etc., you can start seeing the complexity of what you're having to build. That's why good planning is required. So what do we need from public transit? We need lighting, CCTV, help buttons to keep you safe. One of the things is this safety issue. We've already on the KTM network on the commuters already has the women-only carriages. It's providing good bus infrastructure, so good bus stops. Things are accessible. Someone's obviously spent a fortune on this. The only problem is you can't get to it from either side, pretty much. But that's on Jalan Parliament, and we've got to accept the safety issue. So that's the back of a vehicle I was travelling in when working in Rio de Janeiro. Ironically, a bus went into the back of us, but road transport and individual transport, as we've identified, is less safe than public transport. What do we need from public transport? Well, comfort. So there's me 16 years ago sitting on the fastest train in the world in Shanghai, but it's reading the newspaper. So you want that ability to board, doors versus seats. You've got to consider if you're on a heavily laden transport, you want 5 doors. if you're on a long distance train, you only end up with 2 doors in a carriage. It's little things, but it's also making sure that people can read papers. Relax, or if it's a shorter journey, standing things to hold. As a commuter, your life kind of changes, and you think about things differently in terms of experiences based on journey length and journey type. So it brings us to transit-oriented development. So, this just picking up on 2 of the schemes in KL. So if we've got rail, it's really trying to keep something within a 400-metre radius. So it's high-intensity developments, and bus, the quoted figure is 200 metres. This is listed from Plan Malaysia. Looking at land use and opportunities for land use, it's housing, malls, hotels, schools and colleges. It's bringing something into that hub, and also sort of, extending that into daycare centres, leisure and sports facilities. We want to create something that people can access. It's then bringing in active mobility. But I've walked around the KL central area, and it's not a great place to walk around. It's very difficult to navigate. The other one is, the other one I've shown is Latitude 8, which is kind of, I think, a semi-failed development at LRT Dan Wangi. It was Prasarana's first attempt at TOD. But it's also how we integrate to the local area. So many developments seem to be in splendid isolation. They stand on their own. So, if we look at the existing, so that's Cheras Eco Mall and Pasar Seni Station, where it's being connected into KL Old Station. But it's making those connections out from transport into these local areas. It's not quite often you almost see a developer, and it's something we've struggled with in the UK on some of the wider areas for the projects I've been involved with, that we build barriers and build blockages. So it's connecting with the surroundings. It's removing excessive parking costs. And you kind of go, well, what do you mean by that? Well, say, for example, the condominium I live in is in a very central area. There's lots of public transport around me. We've got 5 or 6 floors, if not more, of parking, most of which sits there empty. So there must be a huge cost in building this. And it's saying, but to me, the challenge at present is we've got that attitude of, if you build something, you've got to provide it, because everyone in Malaysia needs a car park space, especially the sort of person who would live in a condo. So it's rethinking what we do with developments and getting the proportions right, and thinking how we share things. Car share is, becoming more common. So then everybody shares the benefits of the development. It's quite easy to have major developments going on. The surrounding residents get the pain. It's then opened and there's nothing for them in it. But it's also making these sustainable. And I'm a great believer in the importance of mixed development. So, rather than trying to build one thing, it must incorporate as broad a range as possible. If you're bringing housing, you need to be bringing education and health care and, all these sorts of things. You just building luxury or residentials or new condos in the middle of nowhere is going to create those sort of challenges for us and perpetuate them. Was going to introduce a Jamboard, but seeing as the time, I will hold it on for. No, we can do that as we go through at the end. Noting the time, it's about perfect.
You want to do the Jamboard now?
No. Let's hold it over. We can see how question and answer go and take it from there.
Okay, because we have several questions from the participant. You want me to read now?
No, I've got 4 more slides, and then that's about perfect. So, right. So I think, one of the things I was looking at. So if we just hold on the Q&A for 5 minutes, then that'll take me to the concluding slide. So we need to create modal shift. We've got far too much dependent on public transport. One of the ones is kind of, and this is pulled from a paper, and I'm sure some of you probably recognise the names. So there's a lack of information about alternatives. We've had reflected back to us by some public groups. I didn't even know there were buses in such and such. I won't name the state, but it just shows, how invisible they become, how lack of interest has changed. Only, if we try and get people to change, only some car drivers are willing to try, so there's these perceptions of travel time and cost. And in Malaysia particularly, sort of, there does seem to be an excuse of comfort and heat and all these sorts of things, but we know that other places in the region don't necessarily suffer from the same issues. This survey also had a look at what was done from in JB. This is where, this gender equality, but it's interesting to note that over 55% of the public transport usage they recorded was female. The majority of trips were made by people aged between 20 and 24, so a lot of people on this session. In general, the users were employed, significant numbers of students, small numbers of unemployed, and a small percentage of retired people. But as ever, there was this great concern over punctuality and inability to provide timetable. And the bus operators' view of reliability was in sharp contrast. So when talking to operators, there's very much two perceptions, and this is all part of the broader educational piece. So if we look at the role of cost in creating that modal shift, there's this incentivization. So we've got, integrated ticketing between modes. If we can create forms of integrated ticketing, it becomes easier for people to travel. It doesn't become a barrier to travel. However, there are costs to that. If frequently people are being asked to use technology or pay deposits on cards. And this happens in other cities, and these themselves can become barriers to their use. Acknowledging the introduction of the My 100 and My 30 tickets for citizens, I don't get a cheap ticket, and that enables people to know what they're spending each month. So fair policy sits behind this, looking at reduced ticket prices as well. So if people do have money and they can invest it, or companies run public fare subsidy deals or fare loans or something like that. So it enables people to buy cheaper tickets, and weekly, monthly, quarterly and annual ones are something that are seen, say, out of the UK and have been since I was growing up. Those were the sort of standard methods. And also looking at off-peaks, so it's encouraging people to travel outside rush hours, but also by reducing fares, getting people on. Looking also at the challenge of flat fares, so getting all fares the same on a bus route or within a certain time, and obviously that can then be shared out. So if you really start looking at fare zones, I did a whole talk on fare policy for Ho Chi Minh City a couple of years ago, so I'm more than happily to talk about fare policy for ours. It's a fascinating topic in itself, but and the use of free buses, because they really come into their own on social routes and connections to hospitals and things like that, but also as a means of moving people around congested inner city areas, which is exactly what GoKL's doing with its I think that's the red line, or is it the blue line? I can't remember, but there's about 7 or 8 lines and more being introduced. So if we look at the role of technology in creating modal shift, technology and this really enables the mobility as a service, and technology is one solution. It's convenient, it's low cost because the user supplies a lot of the technology to assist it, and it also provides evidence for planning. But just reflecting back on our recent experience of using the app, and this was trying to get people to sign up to an app, and this was the age range of people signing up to it, and this has got to be the concern that we, by using technology, we're actually freezing out some of the people who would benefit. And we acknowledge that we've got a relatively small elderly population looking at the demographics, but the realities are that we know the retired people will choose to use the bus. They don't want to necessarily keep a car. So we look at all these things and think, how do we factor these in? And whilst this is just the distribution of those that readily accepted the travel survey app, it does represent a challenge. And so we need to understand that accessibility to technology, the factors that age and cost have with that. It's very easy for apps to suddenly go, well, we won't support that platform, but that's where your users are. And how that correlates with the existing users. So but we also then need to consider how we can influence car users within that. So it's creating seamless journeys and seamless experience. But obviously, if you're having to use some form of taxi or Grab or e-hailing within that whole formula, that's going to push costs up. Once people are in a particular mode, they start thinking differently, and this, it's changing that. It's creating that seamless connectivity. And just to conclude, the role of buses, whatever approach is taken in Malaysia to create this modal shift, Malaysia will still rely on buses for much of its public transport for the foreseeable future. The cost of building fixed infrastructure is huge. The buses which are flexible, you've got a low density environment, aren't going to go away. And need to be thought about and integrated in what we do. So, yeah, they've been with us since 1901, as I think I identified, and they're going to be with us, into the future. They may be added to by other modes, but they're still going to be the fundamental way of getting around, and it's that which is going to need consideration. 10:30, how about that? Sorry. Thank you very much.
So thank you for your presentation. Can we take the questions from participants now?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Do you want to read some? And
we have the first questions from. No, they write in English, so you can read also.
Yeah.
So we have the questions from Muhammad Norman Fikri Muhammad Anhar. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Michael. Since you've been in Malaysia for a long period of time, do you think that the climate or weather influence the mass in using private vehicle more than a public transport? And do you have any suggestions to improve the usage of the public transport if weather is at a play here in Malaysia? So this is kind of like the weather issue or the weather factor that influence the usage of the public transports.
Yeah, I mean, acknowledging, it is a challenge. My experiences in Indonesia were actually working outside as a field surveyor. So I'm doing a 10-hour day outside in Indonesia. Yes, you do get heavy rain as well. That was on Java. So yeah, these are problems that won't go away. We clearly, and this is where we need to carefully consider some of the siting issues of things like bus. I mean, I'm going to keep talking bus because bus unfortunately is that fundamental. And when we look outside KL, but I think some of the things that I've shown you, we do create our own barriers. If you look at some of the countdowns, you get the countdowns on traffic lights, and they're there for a very long time. In the London experience, it tends to be much shorter cycles. We point out that people will walk 5 minutes to a bus stop, 10 minutes to a bus stop. I mean, there was a discussion on Transit Malaysia about how far people will walk the other day. Fascinating, interestingly enough. But there are distinct limits. However, I've seen traffic lights with 180-second phase. That's 3 minutes. If you can't cross the road for 3 minutes and it's raining, you're not likely to be very happy. Yeah. So we need to factor in, if we're going to create that shift and that thinking shift, then we need to create that level of thought. I mean, when I pointed that out in a meeting, you could see the look of hadn't even dawned on people, it hadn't crossed their minds. So these are kind of the broader issues. So we need to address that, and that's all about creating this permeability. The more difficult we make it, I watch people come out of Dang Wangi LRT when going to work. They immediately cross over and walk down the central median because the crossing point's in the wrong place. It's not going to help them. We need to rethink our first and last mile experience, and some of this is actually just simplifying the road network. You tell I'm a great lover of Malaysia's one-way systems, or rather I'm not. But all these barriers that we've created, we need to start breaking them down and understanding how we can increase permeability within cities, because that's the only way we're going to enable people to access public transport. Even the picture of the lovely bus stop I showed, the one on the other side of the road, the nearest crossing point is 150 meters away and involves going through a subway.
Exactly. Right. So I think the issue of environment, I think we can tackle, or we can solve it with the design elements or something.
Well, you're never going to. We're not going to lose rain, and we're not going to lose heat.
Yeah, exactly.
But we need to, So if we look at it from a risk hierarchy, and you're going to go eliminate, reduce, isolate, control, what we can do is, saying, well, what's the bad experiences? It's the heat and the rain. Well, we can try and reduce it by reducing the time it takes to access it. Can we isolate it? Well, yeah, we can actually, better bus shelters and perhaps more covered ways, making sure that the bus stops are correctly located, or any form of stop or station is, the access is optimized to reach the street and where the maximum number of people are coming from.
Yeah.
Controlled by everybody an umbrella, I guess, but that's
yeah. All right. Okay. So I hope my answer your questions, Mr. Norman. And then we have the second questions from Mr. Muhaimin Saleh. Good morning, Michael. What are the aspects to be considered when proposing public transport in a new development city? And how can government motivate the public to use the public transport instead of private vehicle in Malaysia? I think the second questions from Mr. Muhaimin is quite difficult to answer, because I think it's more related to your mindset, your behavior, your how you accept the public transport.
It's interesting. I'm talking to in a new development city, but irrespective, it's also thinking about what we set out to achieve. And this is, I hasten to add, these are my views, not those of Mott MacDonald or GFCP. But we need to change mindsets and thinking. So the picture I showed of Pasar Seni, with the car park out the front, we're in the middle of downtown KL. Why are we providing lots of parking in the middle of downtown KL? Are we admitting, this is deliberately provocative. I have a reputation for being provocative, but it's, asking a question, but, are we deliberately saying that, our public transport's not very good, therefore come to Pasar Seni in your car, when in fact there's a perfectly good LRT and MRT station within 300 meters. We need, and I think actually, if you look at a new development in a city, it's saying, well, have we created a new city where public transport is prioritized? And one of my favorites is apart from OKU parking, is the public transport, nearest public transport access, normally a bus, closer than the public parking or further away. If it's further away, then you've failed. We need to think about how we integrate public transport into the fabric of hospitals. I mean, not necessarily schools, but retail developments and all these. I went to PWTC yesterday to have my COVID-19 jab. I'm fine. But it's interesting, just, even there, I'd not visited before, but trying to work my way around it was a complete nightmare. Whereas if I'd driven to it, I would have just got out of my car and walked in. We've created artificial barriers by not thinking about how we develop these things. And I think that, the motivation will be, sadly, at some point, even in new cities, the cost of driving will rise because we can't afford to subsidise fuel much more, and the implication of trying to get that reduction in carbon, the cost of parking has to be recognised. And as I say, if you're building why are we subsidising multi-storey parking in places where we can be, providing it cheap when we should be providing access? So it's thinking about, factoring all those into how we plan things.
All right. Okay. I would like to add. Yeah, maybe some of the local authority in Malaysia, they are very, very well in campaigning the low carbon city framework, but at the same time they convert the unused space or the lost space in our city centre to parking. So I think the local government initiative and the policy is not balanced between what they want to do and what they implement in our city. So I think that's make our our car user prefer to ride the vehicle instead of using the public transport. But I hope my answer your questions, Mr. Mohaimin. And then the third questions come from Arifa Nabila. Good morning, Mr. Michael. Is there the limit length of MRT route, especially in Malaysia, to achieve TOD? Limit length of
Interesting question. And it kind of harks back to or reflects back on the picture or the graph I showed of journey times on KTM network. You know, if we're going, to me, probably the answer is no, because what we almost want to do is create each section of the line to operate individually. I mean, understanding it's a whole connection. The lines in Kuala Lumpur, because of the density, are exceptionally long. You know, they're, if I'm going to get the figures slightly wrong, but it's, if I remember, it's about 54 and 56 kilometres, line 1 and line 2. There's still a debate about line 3. So I'm not fully up to date on where that stands, and that's a whole other story, and happy to talk about that one. But these routes are very long, and it takes an hour. It takes 90 minutes to travel from one end to the other. And whilst we normally design them for 100km/h running, you know, the maximum operational speeds tend to be about 80. As I commented earlier, you know, you do get these very sharp curves and the speeds drop, so, and that's what pushes this time up. So whilst we, you know, if you introduce TOD, you've really got to be targeting it at a relatively small area. I think and that's really what we've got to understand from the planning process. In exactly the same way as we plan a station or a bus stop within 200 meters or 500 meters. If your TOD is intended to attract people and not just house people, then you need to be factoring in an acceptable journey time that people will find to access it. The realities of building very, very large developments and then realizing that you actually haven't got anybody who's going to fund it. I can remember living in, and you know, it's what we're witnessing now under COVID. You know, some of the malls or shopping malls that have got smaller footprints on them, you know, in terms of people actually accessing them and using them, you know, they're losing their key tenants. And that's a lesson to us all, and it shows that without that footfall, you know, for other purposes, that some of these places will struggle. One of my nearest ones, and I'll quote it, is Quill City Mall on Jalan Sultan Ismail, and you know, Aeon has pulled out, and that must have been, you know, one of their biggest providers. So you know, thinking in those sorts of terms, and you know, TOD is not a shopping mall, but it, you know, thinking of it, using it as a comparator, those become the questions, and you know, you need to get the footfall and the usage in to get the rents up. So it's an economic battle as well. So you know, it costs a lot of money to develop them, as I'm sure Prasarana is finding out with the Latitude 8 development.
Yeah, okay. So Arifa, I hope my answer your questions. And then we move forward to the questions number 4 from Mr. Matana. I don't know, Mr. or Mrs. Matana from Transit MY. Hello, sir. In Malaysia, is it possible to build BRT in existing highways, or do we need to build additional or separate lane for BRT like Sunway BRT? Which is the better option, and what you think about using ART as alternative to bus?
I think, you know, the BRT ART concept is here. You know, where it's going to expand. It's recognised around the world. We've been involved as a business on quite a few projects around globally on it, and you know, some of that experience we're putting in to support what we're doing, and it creates these hubs. I think if we're picking up on the modal shift argument, you perhaps from my previous comments, it may not surprise you that I think that wherever possible we should be running them down existing roads. That's on cost grounds and on the slight discouragement grounds. There is nothing more annoying as a driver to see, sorry, this is psychology and human factors, but it's when you see something whiz past you when you're sitting in a traffic jam and it's got a lane to itself. So and this comes down to enforcement of things like bus lanes. So and if we've got segregation, I think in general, understanding that we've got to create this shift, and the worst thing that you can create is complete chaos by blocking things up entirely. But in the realities are that if we're going to do it effectively, and my concerns about things like the Sunway BRT is its massive grade separation, i.e. its separation from the existing topography and having to go up, and you're creating really expensive stations, everything, then your costs just all rise incrementally. And we want to mitigate that as much as possible. I'm from McDonald, Malaysia, and working on the Global Future Cities project. Oh, sorry, that's you asking Mathana, isn't it? Yeah. I'll just carry on answering any question that comes up.
All right, okay. So this is regarding the BRT question, but I open the questions from the student. If you have any question to ask to Mike, so please raise your hand and turn on your mic, and I will give you a room to answer to ask the questions. Okay, so last questions from Mr. Faris. I think this is he is a UiTM student. Good morning, Mr. Michael. I have one question. So what is your opinion on bringing TOD development into suburban area? If there any possibility to develop TOD concept in suburban area, or is it not reliable at all? Thank you. Thank you, Paris. So
yeah, good question. I think it comes, and it comes back to what we the previous question slightly, because the benefit that you can create, and this is where planning and city planning is so fundamental, because we've got this donutization, and the minute we start taking TOD into these sorts of areas, I'm not saying everything has to be in the middle, but it becomes a challenge in itself. So but this is where it's important to plan and zone these things so that we create these things in areas of maximum opportunity. One of the ones, and it is a fascinating topic, because if you start looking at, say, bus stations, these a TOD concept which would integrate a bus station with an MRT station or an LRT station with links into the city become a good prospect. I, for example, live at the southern end, very much suburban, of one of the tube lines in London, the underground lines in London. But it's interesting that even though lots of people focus in on it as kind of a station at the end of a line, the footfall in the town centre around it is actually very, very low, because people are really just commuting through. And I think this would be one of the challenges: is if you built housing and a mixed development above it, yes, you can create these things. It comes back to this mono-use problem and getting the right densities to work. But creating a transport hub as part of your TOD, to me, is fundamental, because you've got to be discouraging car use, which comes back to one of the other questions, and just thinking about how we approach it through the planning stages.
Okay, so there's the answer from questions, Paris, but I think the population density, the social demography is very important to integrate when you plan TOD in suburban area. Okay, and then we have another questions. We still have a time, like 10 minutes more. Good morning, Mr. Michael. I have a question. What is your opinion regarding TOD development and public transport during the pandemic situations in Malaysia? Like, seems we're going to take a long period to be back to normal. It is relevant for it to be applied in Malaysia for now. So TOD, and during the uncertainty crisis, what we are facing now, like COVID-19. So what's your opinion?
It's an interesting one. We fortunately also been working with some developers just recently in Malaysia, just in conversation, because nothing's really happening, and that obviously is the problem. So what might be a city centre site starts off as a sort of, when they got access or get access to the land, maybe a luxury development and some offices, all of a sudden the whole mode and use and percentage uses are changing radically. You know, we're seeing the, you know, well, in the UK experience, you know, no one really is in the office still, despite, you know, what numbers are there. So my son works in central London, he's not in the office. So, you know, numbers in offices, and I look around Bangsar South whenever I go there, which is where our office is located. You know, numbers are massively down, and that has a massive implication for the things that surround it. And this is, you know, part of that challenge is if you've just got an office environment, then that has to support the surrounding businesses. So, you know, the reality is it's this sort of agile nature. Yeah, it's going to be very difficult to plan, but I think you know, it is a good chance to reset, look at some of the plans, and say, well, are we creating a logic for when we gradually open back up, whenever that is. It's not easy. We need to look at those splits. We need to understand what we're doing. Hence, you know, that sort of mixed activity, creating almost a township with its own, you know, the main link and that hub type arrangement with other transport modes perhaps becomes a reasonable model, that you're assisting urbanisation, which is a trend that I think is still going on. I know, you know, some experiences are that people have very much dispersed now because of this, and I understand that many students are still going to be working from home and wherever they are spread around Malaysia. And, you know, how much will we gather together? But the reality, I suspect, is the jobs will still be in the urban areas,
exactly.
and that's what's going to drag people in, and therefore we need to be housing and creating communities in those areas. So perhaps rather than commercial TOD, we need to be looking at TOD, which is where I was going. It's the mixed development. It's supplying employment, housing, you know, creating a full living TOD, but also integrating that into its surrounds much better.
Yeah, I think it's not only TOD itself that facing the challenge during the pandemic. I think most of the mode of transportation, bus, LRT, or our railway transit, facing the decreasing in the number of riderships since MCO 1.0, when we have the first lockdown in Malaysia. So the number of ridership decreased because many of us start work from home, and then the students are not going to the campus. So what do you think about the challenges? How the public transport sector or industry going to cope with the challenges?
I mean, the public transport around the world has been blitzed. You know, revenues are massively down. They're all struggling to keep going. You know, because and this is where we need so many different levels of intervention, and that's, you know, we're not. It's not going to go away. We can't, understanding that car use has potentially gone up because of this desire not to mix on public transport, albeit that we're doing less journeys. You know, the percentage, and this is one of the things that we're trying to look at from our household travel survey. Unfortunately, you know, the challenges in some of the areas are that sort of public transport ridership was relatively small and therefore not so easily captured. So we're not really getting a full understanding of the shift. But yeah, it goes much wider than public transport. Public transport takes you somewhere, and I think, you know, harking back to the previous question, if we have got, where does public transport go? A lot of those places are being lost as well. So this is where we need to rethink some of the routes, some of the, you know, how we're servicing them and what we're doing with them. Yeah,
exactly. So I would like to know your honest opinion. Okay, in Malaysia, actually, what do you think? Either we need more MRT, LRT, or actually we need more buses on the road?
Well, I think you'll realise that, you know, and this is one of my concerns, and all the reviews I've picked up. You know, if we identify, and it's just flipping back to one of the slides where we were sorry, I'll get them at people at decent size. One of the slides presented where we were talking about the TOD plans and sort of 200 meters for buses, 400 meters for metros. We're caught with the same sort of issue. So can we get that infrastructure within that distance of so many members of the population? You know, it's a and this is where we need the DOSM data ready to inform us from the census where people live, what population densities are. If you know, and following, you know, when you just look at the densities, and you know, I know Singapore, say, trying to get a MRT station within 400 meters of everyone, and you look at the practicalities of doing that in Malaysia, and I kind of go, no, it's not going to happen. I'm sure we're going to end up with some of the key routes into existing older cities being bus rapid transit or ART, you know, whichever variant, over time, as Kuching and Iskander probably attest. But I think in the reality, the only way to connect all these communities without spending huge sums is creating bus transit. Or bus, you know, using buses, which is why I've kept harking back to it, because I can't see any other way of affording it. You know, we can all come up with fantastic plans, but most of them are absolutely unaffordable. And if we actually want to create that shift, we've got to do it step by step. There is, you know, and that means, and that's where I kind of dwelt on the page on fair policy. You know, one of the things that we got to do is change habit, and there is an old statement attributed to Margaret Thatcher, but she didn't actually say it, but it was always quoted that, you know, if a man, when he gets to 30, I can't, or whenever, in his working life is still taking the bus, then, you know, he's not really a success, you know, he's more of a failure. And that, whilst, you know, obviously not true, but, you know, it's kind of a mindset that prevailed 35 years ago. What in London has seen is, and this is where I have concerns about, say, the use of school buses and taking other buses, is that it removes people away from the main public transport system. And the more people share the experience, the more it becomes a common shared experience, the more people will use it in future. So in London, they introduced free public transport or free travel on buses for under 18s and students. And of course, that's been running for 20 to 25 years, and it's created a generational change towards attitudes to buses. The challenge in Malaysia will be getting a bus fleet that's reliable, people know when it's turning up, etc., to do it, because if you don't turn up for class, you've still got problems. But I think, you know, part of it is rethinking that as a problem and saying, well, we need to be achieving some of these basic goals. And that, you know, to me, it's the bus, but also making that bus representative of society and its wider aspects.
I'm sorry, I lost my connection. All right.
It was a great answer, I can tell you.
But the video is recorded, so I will take a look again. Okay, so I open to anyone who have any questions, last questions before we end the session, because we already of the webinar. Anyone, students from UiTM, if you have the questions, you can raise your hands and you can turn on your mic.
There's a question about bringing rail under public control. I think, yeah, I mean, I've been involved on rail. I never worked for any of the railways. A lot of my colleagues did, and it's you know, sometimes we need to rethink and reset what we do.
Exactly.
I think, you know, the split of train and infrastructure has been a problem. We've got, obviously in Malaysia, you've got RAC and KTM, you know, and it's the relationship between those, but it's also really defining what you want to do. There are kind of, you know, and there were problems with BR in as much as, you know, there were problems with so that's British Rail pre-privatisation, which was 95, and you know, it's some of these are attitudinal changes, and I'm sure, you know, they reflect around the world, and, you know, we're there to deliver a service, and it's the concept of providing a service as public transport, much bigger issue, but I'm happy to talk about that offline.
So I think Mike already answered the questions by MZ Kamaru. So thank you, Mike, for answering the questions. All right. So I think that no one's going to ask the questions anymore because we already the end of the webinar. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining us, and I'm very honored that you joined us as a speaker to the Urbanism Talk series, especially for the final year students who are currently doing their project, TOD project in Pulau Sebang, Melaka. I think I briefed you earlier in our email. So I really hope that students can can give advantage to the students to provide you better knowledge on the transit system, on the TOD or the public transport itself. And I hope the proposal or the planning proposal much better, and you can solve the issue that occur in Pulau Sebang, Melaka. So thank you, Mike. Thank you again. Thank you for the students and all the participants from outside from UiTM. We are very appreciate your participation, and inshallah for the next session we are going to have another Urbanism Talk series, and maybe another topic, and we will like to invite everyone to join us later. So thank you much, Mike. We were going to keep in touch with you further for another project maybe, and for the rest of the project, public transport. I hope that I can meet you maybe in KL or Johor Bahru. Where is Johor Bahru? Is my hometown. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. So maybe we can take a group photo. Hirzi, can everyone turn on the camera? So we can take a group photo. We have the lecturers, we have the students, we have outsider from UiTM who join us. So maybe can you turn on the camera? Time turn on camera, nak ambil gambar baru dia on camera. Mike, do you know how to speak Malay?
Sedikit.
Nice. All right. So please turn on your camera, and Hirzi will take a screenshot. Okay, ready? Ready, Hirzi? Okay, dah belum? Yeah, okay, all right. So thank you everyone for joining us. We see you next time in another Urbanism Talk series. Thank you, Mike. See you. Bye.
Thank you. Terima kasih semua.
Sama-sama. So nanti Miss akan share video recording dekat lecturer, and then lecturer will pass to you lah. And then slide nanti Miss akan minta dekat Mike kalau dia nak share. I think slide dia banyak info and data you can use untuk studio ataupun bantu you punya ni proposal nanti. Banyak data especially on Greater KL punya ridership data tu. And then the policy, National Transport Policy. So okay. Dah habis kerja. Bye Dr. Tim, bye Dr. Nasa. Thank you.
Tolong minta slide Thank you.
Boleh. Nanti saya email dekat Mike. Hopefully dia bagi kot, dia okay je. Okay. So thank you everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you Dr. Tim. So boleh continue studio.
Alright.
Thank you, May.
Dah habis baru dengar suara masing-masing. Tadi suruh tanya tak ada soalan, tak nak tanya. Bertuah budak-budak.
Tanya May, saya tanya tadi.
Ya. Kalau siapa yang tanya minta A dengan Dr. Tim.
Very good.
Kalau dapat. Alright, okay. Bye everyone.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Alhamdulillah.